So, Joe, I was at home, but what did you think?
I had a really interesting experience with this film. It was very much a film of two halves for me. About 40 minutes in, I completely lost patience with it and decided that I didn't like the film at all. And it begins with in a very sort of it's got a very fragmentary storytelling style. It's quite disjointed. You can't tell to begin with what the connection is between the characters, and that technique recurs throughout the film. There are occasional sort of interludes where we follow a character apparently randomly, and sometimes they come back into the story, sometimes they don't. It begins and ends with the images of a donkey and a dog, and you're not really sure of their significance. And so I was both intrigued by that style and then started to interrogate it. And then, as I say, till about 40 minutes in, I was frustrated and annoyed by it, and I found it kind of silly. And I suppose the reason is because if you if you have a film that is sort of structured around conventional narrative logic, then you start following the film and you engage with the film on a particular level. You know, you start to detect the narrative arc and what's going to happen and anticipate what might happen, and your expectations are met or subverted, and that constitutes your engagement with the film. Now if you design a film that intentionally subverts that kind of storytelling style that is not about the narrative arc, then you depend, I think, on a sense of internal logic to draw the reader along. So if I watch a film and it's clearly not telling me a story in any conventional sense, but has a sense of internal logic, whether I can identify or explain to myself what that logic might be or not, you can tell when it's there, and a film seems kind of propulsive and compelling, despite the fact that perhaps the story isn't conventionally told. And I found this, to begin with, I found this film bereft of that internal logic. And so the result was these disconnected sequences seemed to me more or less random, and it just felt daft. And I finally lost patience when there was a sequence in like a staff room, I think quite late at night, which itself was strange. And the teachers were there as though they'd been there for hours and hours and hours. There was a fairly solemn conversation going on in the foreground. Then in the background, one of the teachers just casually put a helmet on his head. And it was a touch of sort of silly absurdism that I just thought, oh, I've had enough. I'm bored of this. And I was kind of done with the film. But of course, I'm going to carry on watching it because we're going to talk about it. And then I think it's about 40 minutes through anyway, maybe like halfway mark. There is this extraordinary scene in which the woman, the character's name is Astrid, talks to that director about the film he's made. And it's a really long scene. And she starts explaining why she disliked the film. And then it turns out she didn't dislike the film. She hated it. She found it disgraceful what the filmmaker had done. And what he had done was, of course, we don't see any of the film. We only have her description of it. And she didn't see the whole film. She just saw this one scene. And she describes this terminally ill patient who has no control over their body and is therefore honest. There is an honesty in the terminally ill person. And that terminally ill person meets or works with a dancer who, of course, sort of makes their living out of manipulating the body. And the woman sees this as ultimately a dishonest thing, a performance. And she sees although the director sees the meeting of these two people as somehow cathartic, she sees it as horribly dishonest and disgraceful. And so what's fascinating about the film is at that point, it became for me, and this might be a really idiosyncratic reading, whether this is there in the text or not, I don't know. But this was my experience of the film, that it became at that point a film about the processes of interpretation, the principles of interpretation, because you have this long sequence in the middle of the film that is long enough and strange enough to really draw attention to itself, and that seems to talk about themes that have a direct bearing on the film itself, and that seems to ask the viewer to kind of recast and reframe our analysis of what we've already seen and what we're about to see in light of this conversation. So it like presents itself as an interpretive key to the rest of the film. Then I was thinking that the emotional continuity or an emotional engagement with a film depends on emotional continuity, right? So if I start to care about a character and something bad happens to them, I experience a sense of anxiety or whatever. Now, if you fracture or upset that emotional engagement with text, either through, as this film does, interrupting the story with apparently random sequences, or editing in such a way that it's difficult to tell what is happening when and what is the temporal or causal connection between things, then you fracture that emotional engagement. And so I'm no longer reading the film in that intuitively emotional level. I can, however, be intellectually engaged with the film. And so that is what happened at this midpoint. I'm now intellectually engaged with this film, and I'm looking for a way to analyze and interpret what I've seen. However, the movie synopsis, really interestingly, and of course it's just a kind of off the cuff synopsis, so you shouldn't read too much into this, but it became really interesting to this whole train of thought. That little synopsis does frame the film in emotional terms. It says this is a film about a woman whose husband dies and who struggles to make sense of that death. And so it frames the film in almost alarmingly anodyne emotional terms. And I flatly reject the emotional interpretation of the film. And yet the film does then, in the second half at least, perform that kind of arc, because immediately after she's told us her husband died, she then goes home and starts screaming at the kids. And I realized that we have this sort of inbuilt propensity to jump on those kind of causal connections and infer an emotional interpretation, right? So it's sort of hardwired in us to say, so her husband died. That must be why. That must explain X, Y, and Z. And so the film both encourages a straightforward emotional interpretation of itself and frustrates that interpretation through the way it's edited and assembled. And I think the reason it does so, or the reason it did so for me, was to challenge and interrogate the whole process of interpretation. And so it becomes a film about the fact that we cannot help but tell ourselves in storied terms. And yet that story we tell, which structures our sense of self, is a performance. And its performative nature makes it artificial and dishonest. And so we are stuck in this kind of ambiguity, this sort of gray area where we cannot help but perform the story of ourselves, and yet we're so often frustrated by the fact that our sense of self feels dishonest and untrue. And so that is what the film became for me. And funnily enough, I was reading Bart's autobiography at the same time, and there is a section where he writes, once you start even telling the story of your day, you constitute yourself in fantasy as a writer, or worse still, you constitute yourself. You get stuck with the self you have made up. The story becomes compulsory. And of course, there is the whole, and I wrote about this a lot for my thesis, hermeneutics and the theory of the self as narrative. You know, the self is a story and nothing else. That obviously denies the kind of phenomenological underpinning of the self, but that is a very compelling idea that the self, as we commonly understand it, the sort of folk psychological interpretation of the self, is a story. And so the film is about the frustrations inherent in that. And that kind of makes sense of, I guess, the fact that the kids are performing Hamlet throughout the whole thing. Why Hamlet particularly? I'm not entirely sure. I think the first piece of Hamlet we get, I think, is in the scene where the actors are present. You know, he puts on that play to try and work out, you know, who's guilty and who's not. So it's a film about performance, I think, and a film about the self. And I found it ultimately really intellectually really stimulating. I had almost no emotional connection to it, but then I think that was intentional. And the very fact that I had no emotional connection to the film is what sparked this kind of interest in it. So yes, a very interesting film. Halfway through, I was done with it. I thought it was daft. By the end, I thought it was fascinating.
I really enjoyed your review of it because I think we went in slightly different directions with it, but yeah, some similarities in the experience. I mean, I too found this film quite difficult at first, but not for the same reasons as you. The fragmented nature of it never really bothered me. I kind of just accepted that it's like the pieces of a jigsaw, but you haven't got all the pieces. And it felt like there was enough there. And I kind of quite liked the ambiguity of you know, a lot of what with the, you know, the different strands of the film that we were seeing. But what I found an uncomfortable experience was I found this film kind of excruciatingly depressing and bleak for the first period. You know, it's interesting because watching the last film we watched, Atlantis, there's a similar kind of theme of there's trauma and there's massive emotions underneath the surface that are, you know, waiting to explode out. And you know, there's similarities, but in that we were given these beautiful images right from the start. There was always a poetry, there was always a beauty in that film. So there was some relief in that. Whereas this film, I kind of just felt so sorry for her in a way, you know, with the bike and I guess I, you know, kind of identify with that feeling when just everything feels like it's going against you. So I was finding it incredibly negative. I think then where it changed for me was there comes a bit of relief where there's a scene where she's dancing with the children in the hospital. And then there's the scene immediately afterwards, I think it's immediately afterwards, in the gallery, where, you know, it just has a little bit of silence as she stands next to these other people looking at this painting. And that's a kind of really, you know, that feels like relief as well. Those two things, it was like, oh God, this film isn't just going to be a kind of really depressing film of how difficult her life is. And so from that point on, it was probably a little bit before when the film changed for you. The film started changing for me. I too, once it came to that scene with the conversation with the filmmaker, I agree that that is central to the film. I mean, it probably is in the middle of the film, isn't it? And it just feels so important. And I like the way you kind of describe about it's important for going backwards in interpreting what you've seen, but also in what you're about to see. It's kind of interesting, isn't it, putting the most important bit in the middle of the film rather than say at the beginning or at the end. Yeah. And I just, like you, I just loved that conversation. It was just so compelling. It was also, there was relief in that because at one level it was comedy. Yeah. You know, when the guy, I mean, she's ranting about the film, but she's only seen one scene from it. And the guy says, you know, perhaps you should see the whole film because she's got such strong views on it. And then when she says to him, do you understand what I'm saying? And he says, oh, I understand. I understood that a long time ago. You know, it was, I found myself really smiling at that point. And when she said it's unbearably bad cinema, you know, it was great because, yeah, the conversation was so interesting. And I think, I'm surprised you didn't mention Bresson, because for me, Robert Bresson was present in this film right from the start. You know, as soon as I saw the donkey, I mean, I think I mean, I love O Hazard Balthazar, and I love the donkey, and it has a profound impact on me, that film. So anyone showing a donkey in a film, and particularly in this kind of situation where the donkey's not really in the story, the donkey's just staring staring out of a window, you know, kind of looking out on the world. I was thinking of Bresson right from the start. It kind of evoked Balthazar. So when it came to that conversation, I really hooked into the Bresson thinking of kind of actors versus non-actors, and that all acting is a lie. You know, Bresson was obsessed almost with, you know, having his actors not acting, you know, making them repeat the scenes again and again and again to kind of purge all of the acting, and, you know, using non-actors. And so I thought that's what was, you know, clearly referencing kind of Bresson and this kind of debate between, you know, if an actor is opposite a person that's terminally ill and really dying, you know, is it authentic? And I just thought that was so interesting as well, because of the, you know, we've seen the two Chloe Zhao films recently, the one we reviewed, Songs My Brothers Taught Me and Nomad Land, and they both have, and then that other film we reviewed, Stop the Pounding Heart by Robert Minervini. Those films, you know, had very low-key acting, non-actors playing themselves. You know, I think it's a theme that we really, you know, that we really are interested in and talk about a lot, and we've really appreciated those films. You know, so actually you know, Nomad Land is a great example of a film where actors and non-actors working together can really work. You know, I think that I think it you know, it really works. And so, you know, you kind of can disagree with, I guess I would disagree with what she was saying, but kind of agree as well, because, you know, there is a truth in what she was saying as well. So I just thought all that was really, really fascinating. And then, of course, we get to, as you say, interpret what comes next in light of that, because I thought the scene in when she went in the shop and she asked what appeared to be a staff member for a product that had run out on the shelves, and he goes and gets it for her. And then it turns out that he's acting as a shop member. You know, he's not really a shop member, but in fact for her it was totally, it was totally convincing. And so it kind of went against her own thesis that here was this person acting. And if we didn't get that reference, just as when he was told by the shop manager to leave, if we weren't certain that this was kind of what she was getting at, he puts on the crown just to show that he's acting. And I thought that was really, you know, really interesting. Once you've had that conversation, once you've gone through that conversation between Astrid and the filmmaker, these things become so interesting, I think. And I would really like, you know, we've talked on a few reviews about the play within the play. I think the play within the play really works in this film, the Hamlet, but I'm really confused by it. I don't understand it. I want to be able to understand why she's chosen those passages, but I don't. You know, I guess if I went back, and I didn't, if you went back and pulled them out, you know, you may be able to draw some parallels in the meaning, but it worked for me. I mean, there was something odd, because I'm not sure if this is the case, but if it's not, it almost is the case that all of the scenes with the children in are acted Hamlet. We don't, there's one scene I can think of which wasn't them acting Hamlet, which was where they go to the hospital and ask, you know, if the boy's there. But literally, apart from that, whenever we see the children in school or in the woods, they're always speaking lines from Hamlet. And so they're in real life but they're always acting. So, you know, there's something of a link there. Yeah, there were flashes, weren't there, of nature and of animals. You know, there were several, apart from the donkey, there were several animals. There was the dog, the rabbit, was it a little bird when she was lying by the river that came, or there was some animal that came by her. So, you know, for me, having Bresson in mind, this was quite spiritual. There was something about purity and healing here in nature, you know, and for me, the closing scenes of them being in nature, of her being in with her children in nature and kind of being at peace, and, you know, felt like a kind of positive ending. And then there was something really calm and reassuring about the donkey at the end, just looking out, as if the donkey is, you know, the divine, kind of just looking out over looking out of the window, watching what's going on. And I mean, the one line from the Hamlet play, which did come towards the end, which did feel relevant, was "the rest is silence." You know, that line, "the rest is silence," felt like that. It kind of made the missing pieces of the jigsaw work for me, because it's like, okay, I've got, you know, enough together to kind of feel like I know what's going on, but there's so much missing, and the rest is silence, the rest is infinite. And so I felt very satisfied at the end. I felt it really came to a nice conclusion, and I have found myself thinking about this film for the few days after I've seen it. So yeah, I really liked it, really enjoyed it.
Oh, really interesting observations. Really interesting to hear you talk about it. And as you were wrapping up there, I realized just what a rich conversation it's provoked. And it didn't feel that way, even, you know, 30, 40 minutes in. It didn't feel like the sort of film that would yield that sort of conversation. What I was thinking as you were talking was, perhaps, and this is more interpretation, but perhaps, you know, that Bressonian emphasis on the animals, perhaps the animals represent an objectivity. You know, animals can't perform or act, and so, and the ambiguity continues there, but they both represent a sort of a sense of harmony, an escape from interpretations of the self, but also like an irresolvable tension, because we cannot inhabit the objectivity of nature or animalhood. And also perhaps the innocence, you know, the sort of cliche innocence of children. Perhaps the fact that they perform exaggerates their innocence, because there is something in Bresson, as you say, there is something very honest, embracing the performative nature of acting. You know, embrace the lie. There is something far more honest in saying, I am acting, I am saying my lines. And of course, the kids perform in a very, you're right, in a very Bressonian way. They say their lines. There is no emotional emphasis, you know, and strangely, their innocence is exaggerated through that, you know. And I wonder if, you know, like you, ultimately, I was unsure why Hamlet, but perhaps, you know, one of the defining features of Hamlet, or characteristics of Hamlet, is his indecision, you know, that kind of paralysis, that he can't act. He doesn't know how to act. And perhaps, you know, perhaps that central theme, maybe, I don't know, I'm reaching a bit, but perhaps, you know, her own paralysis comes from this, you know, that very tension, both wanting to, you know, escape from performance and being bound to performance. And it was really interesting that you pointed out that boy was acting in the supermarket. I was thrown by that scene a little bit, and that didn't occur to me, but you're right. That's a really interesting reading of that.
Yeah. The thing about the animals is interesting, I think, because she says the line that things only become real when you lose control. So once the terminally ill person has lost control of their body, and they're just on this decline, and that, you know, I think that in a sense the animals don't have any control over anything, do they? Animals live in the present like innocent children as well. You know, they don't. you know, and so we see this donkey, we see something quite brutal, because obviously we see this nice rabbit kind of, you know, looking around on the rocks, and then next thing we see the dog tearing it apart, eating it, you know. So it's there's something about the authenticity of letting go and of being. And, you know, that just talking about it now, you know, that feels quite spiritual as well, you know, and that's where the link with, because, you know, Bresson's films are very spiritual, I think, but not, you know, not in an obvious way, or not in a religious way. So, you know, I think that is really important. Do you feel the same about the first half, looking back on it, with, you know, from the end of the film? Do you think the first half works now?
That's really interesting, actually. I don't know. Of course, one of the really fascinating things about hermeneutics and interpretation in this way is that we are naturally compelled to look back on the past as necessary for what happened next. Do you see what I mean? And so once you've come to some kind of vaguely unified interpretation of the whole, I'm bound to think now that the beginning was necessary to get me to that point. Now, how do you start to unpick that? You know, how do I really feel about the beginning? Does that mean re-inhabiting how I felt at the time? Well, that's impossible, you know?
Yeah.
Fascinating ideas.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, certainly, it is certainly the case that there's lots that's not explained in this film. Yeah. The link to the Hamlet play, you know, as we both said, but also this other story of this couple that, you know, where they're splitting up. I mean, that really feels unrelated. It's hard to see how that links to the theme, but in some ways it feels nice, because she hasn't just made it, you know, she hasn't just started from that great conversation in the middle and just built everything, you know, obviously around that. I think there is lots of ambiguity left. There are lots of missing pieces. There is lots of silence that where things aren't explained.
And I guess that's what's different for me about the ending, is that at the risk you take when you have, you know, sequences that don't obviously bear on the central story, the risk is that they start to feel random and that the film feels arbitrary. And the difference is that the first half felt that's exactly how it felt. Like she was just random scenes sort of put together because they were kind of vaguely silly or funny or absurdist. And by the end, I felt there was enough internal logic in the film, even if I can't explicitly state, you know, the contours of that logic, that those scenes which remain anomalous no longer seem random to me or arbitrary. They, you know, they feel sensible. Like they're there for a reason, even if I don't understand what the reason is. So the film, you know, performed a very clever trick.
I mean, the scene with the teachers talking that you talked about, you know, for me, because I was thinking of Bresson, that was so Bressonian. You know, the lines were just delivered so dead. I mean, they're talking about her son, aren't they? They're talking about, you know, a boy with behavioral problems. But yeah, it's just so devoid of any emotion or any real engagement. And as you say, him putting the hat on, you know, kind of denotes acting again, but they're not acting their lines. So, you know, it's hard to see how that scene fits in exactly, apart from it fits to the main theme.
Yeah. I think the reason it put me off, that scene to begin with, was because, you know, there is a profound sincerity in Bresson. You know, he's never doing things because he thinks he's going to get a laugh out of them. And yeah, it felt like that was kind of intentionally comical. I mean, a lot of the film is intentionally comical. It just took me a while to reconcile myself to that. Like, I felt like the filmmaker was just taking the mickey a little bit to begin with, you know? And I think there's a difference between, you know, being humorous, because life is funny, and being sort of silly. And so that scene originally felt kind of silly. The last thing I was thinking was that you're right. We've talked a lot about performance, and it is a fascinating issue. And I've been thinking more and more that I actually have kind of an ethical issue, I think, with the idea of using, or that there's at least something ethically ambiguous and interesting in the idea of using non-actors within a fictional construct, like Chloe Zhao does. Now, there's no doubt she's fantastically good at doing it. And the final product, the films themselves are really entertaining, great movies. But ethically, there's something kind of, and this film certainly, sheds or exaggerates that idea, that the idea of, having a real person acting themselves, but only within certain parameters, only within the parameters that make sense within the fictional construct of this film. There's something really interesting about that, don't you think?
Yeah, and it plugs into contemporary debate, doesn't it, about whether, a non-gay actor should play a gay person, or, a non-disabled actor should play a disabled person. Whether, does it ever make sense for an actor to act being terminally ill? Or should you have an actor that, and that's a very contemporary debate at the moment, isn't it? Which would kind of support her thesis that actually, the acting should be kept to a minimum, that you actually need a person who's had the experience in order to be able to act. So in that way, the non-actors playing themselves are the most authentic actors, according to that view. I'm personally, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that there is a skill in acting that, is meaningful.
I agree, but then on a sort of moral point of view, the skill involved is sort of beside the point. And I think the film actually complicates her apparent view through the performances of those children, because, the Bressonian school of thought says that actually the most honest way to perform is to embrace the lie, accept the lie, and so there and with that kind of attitudinal framework, there's certainly no limitation on who or what you can portray or convey on screen. It's just about, the kind of ethical underpinning, don't pretend, basically, which is an irreconcilable paradox, isn't it? Yes. How do you act on screen without pretending? You can't. And yet, you and I have both seen films in which we feel like they have achieved that.
Yes.
But how you do that, that's an incredibly interesting and fraught debate, isn't it?
Yeah. So, even if this film doesn't work, and I really think it does, I think, just look at the conversation it's provoked. I think it's fascinating. So, really, really successful film and highly recommended.
Yeah, agreed. Really interesting.
What are we doing next?
We're going to watch Shiver Baby by Emma Seligman.
Great. Looking forward to it.